afternoon.
Good afternoon, sir.
Thank you.
सर मुंबई से हैं और विल पे बहुत सारे सेमिनार ले चुके हैं. वेरी रिनाउंड, वेरी लर्नेड पर्सनालिटी फ्रॉम मुंबई, एंड द बैकग्राउंड इटसेल्फ सेज that how much renowned he is. Since long he is producing his seminars on will. Sir, will be indeed, it's great pleasure of the ICI Indore branch, and in this national conference second day we have a eminent and star speaker like Dr. Anup Shah ji. Sir, over to you, please continue.
एक चीज और संकेत भाई बोलना चाहूंगा. सर को मैंने सीटीसी चैम्बर के एक कॉन्फ्रेंस में सुना था, और यू वॉन्ट बिलीव संकेत भाई, नियर अबाउट सर 110 क्वेश्चन आंसर्स जो है वो विल और इन सब पे आपसे जो है उस समय आए थे, और एक सेशन कंप्लीट 3 घंटे का मैराथन किया था. उसके बाद सेकंड सेशन फिर करना पड़ा था. सो we hope that sir
the second session was only on 100 plus question answers. There was no talk, it was only Q&A.
Yes sir.
So should we start?
Sir, please, over to you, sir.
Okay. So good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and it's nice to be again connected with all of you, although virtually. And I've had the pleasure of being in Indore as a speaker, I guess 4 years ago when Pankaj was the chairman. And it's been nice to always, give a talk at Indore branch and at the CIRC. So today, in the span of the next 2 hours, what we intend to do is to take you through estate planning. What are the different facets? And as, Girish ji was just mentioning about the uncertainty which is prevalent today because of COVID, we all realize that life has become very uncertain. So it is very important that we plan today. And if you look at this diagram, that shows it best, that life is like sand passing through an hourglass. You don't know when it's going to get over, how quickly sand will pass. And if you don't plan, you are leaving behind a legacy of problems, litigation, and hurdles for your loved ones. So what is the scope of estate planning? I would divide it into 2 aspects: no planning and estate planning. No planning is very simple. The person just dies. He doesn't have to do anything except die. And then the law will decide who gets what happens, etc. Estate planning, if you want to do, is definitely more complex, more sophisticated, and more useful. It includes something as basic and mundane as joint holding in accounts or nomination, HUFs and HUF partitions, wills, gifts, release deeds, or family trust. So this, in a nutshell, would be the scope of estate planning. When you look at estate planning, you have a plethora of assets which you need to consider: a flat, an office, a clinic, tenanted premises, bank accounts, fixed deposit receipts, insurance policies, units of mutual funds, shares in physical and dematerialized format, digital assets, very important, social media accounts, passwords to online banking accounts, e-commerce passwords. All of this become very important when you're looking at estate planning. Arts, artifacts, sculptures, paintings, foreign assets. After the liberalized remittance scheme of $250,000 per year, every resident Indian can buy a plethora of foreign assets abroad. How do you plan for them in estate planning? Cars, we have luxury cars ranging to as high as 1.5 to 2 crores. Those also need to be looked at from the point of estate planning, and good old jewelry, gold, bullion, silver. Now, what happens if there is no estate planning? As we mentioned, this is the easiest thing a person can do, not plan. Now, here I would divide it into 2 facets. A person has made a will and a person has not made a will. If a person has made a will, it is known as testamentary succession. If a person has not made a will, it is known as intestate succession. Now, in India, we don't have a uniform civil code, and the government is grappling with enforcing a uniform civil code. That means that all personal laws would not be dependent upon the religion which a person professes. Hindu, Muslims, Christians, everybody would have a uniform law. But till such time as we have a uniform code, if a person dies without making a will, or without making a valid will, then the law depends upon what religion he followed when he was alive. So Muslims are governed by Shariat law. Hindus, Jains, Sikhs and Buddhists, all of them are governed by the Hindu Succession Act of 1956. And anybody other than a Hindu or a Muslim, such as a Christian, a Parsi, a Jewish person who is residing in India, would be governed by the Indian Succession Act of 1925. If a person has made a will and the will is valid, then the will of Muslims is governed by Muslim law, again Shariat law of the relevant Muslim branch. But for anybody other than the Muslims, Indian Succession Act 1925 also provides for how to make a valid will. So again, Hindus, Christians, Parsi, Jewish, Sikh, Jain, Buddhist, all governed by Indian Succession Act. So Indian Succession Act plays two roles. A, it governs the wills for everybody other than a Muslim. And B, it looks like in-testament succession for non-Hindu, non-Muslim community. Now, death and domicile is also a very important facet to be borne in mind when looking at succession law. Which law applies to a deceased? For immovable property in India, it is always the law of India. So say a person was domiciled in UK and he has land in India, land succession will always be as per Indian succession laws. When I talk of domicile, what do we mean? It means the place where you have your permanent home. You may be a resident of Dubai, but that's not your permanent home. For an Indian citizen, normally his domicile would be India. Again, domicile could be different than citizenship. You may have acquired citizenship of St. Kitts and be residing in Dubai, but yet your domicile is your permanent home, the place where you were born, the place where your father was born. So the place where you would like to return for good, whether or not you actually return is a different story. For movable assets, the law applies of that country of which he is domiciled. So a deceased was domiciled in India, but he had bank accounts and securities in America. Indian succession laws will apply if he dies. But there is a German who is domiciled in India and has a bank account in India. Here, German succession laws will apply. So the making of his will and intestate succession law will be as per German laws, not as per the Indian Succession Act 1925. This is a very important bifurcation to be borne in mind when looking at which law applies to a deceased. Let us now look at the Hindu Succession Act in more detail, because that forms the bulk of intestate succession law in India. As I mentioned, it applies if there is no will or if there is no valid will. So Hindu succession law, as the name suggests, applies to Hindus, Jains, Sikhs and Buddhists. Definitely not to Muslims, Christians, Parsis or Jewish community. Overrides all past customs, traditions and rituals. We have a lot of customs and traditions in Hindu law of Manusmriti time. All of them are not applicable when it comes to succession because the succession law will apply. It applies when a Hindu dies intestate, that is without making a valid will. Succession to property is then fixed by law and not by his wish or desire. Therefore, it is advisable to always make a will. Now, Hindu Succession Act defines intestate succession based on whether the person dying was a male or a female. Let us first look at a male Hindu who dies without making a valid will. First, everything would go to his class 1 legal heirs. If there are no class 1, they would go to class 2. If there are no class 2 legal heirs, they would go to agnates. And if there are no agnates, they would go to cognates. Order of succession is left to right. So first you look at class 1, then class 2, then agnate, and then cognate. Who is a class 1 legal heir? Very interesting. Son, daughter, mother, widow, or children of predeceased children, or a widowed daughter-in-law. All of them are class 1 legal heirs. Notice, mother is class 1, father is not. So if there is a mother, a widow, and a child, each of them would get a 1/3 share equally. If there is nobody in class 1 legal heir, then you look at whether there are class 2. Father is the first class 2 legal heir. If there is no father, see whether there are siblings, that is brothers or sisters. If there are no siblings, then look at grandparents from the father's side. If there are no grandparents from the father's side, look at grandparents from the mother's side. If there are no grandparents from the mother's side, look whether there are parents' siblings, that is brothers and sisters of the parents. If there are no class 2 legal heirs, we consider whether there are agnates, and if there are no agnates, if there are cognates. Now, what is an agnate and what is an cognate? Somebody who is related wholly through males with me is my agnate, and somebody who is related through male-female or female-female is my cognate. Let me give an illustration to explain the point. My father's brother's daughter is my agnate. Now, what is the commonality between her and me? Two males, my father and her father. So, she is my agnate. But my mother's brother's son is my cognate because the commonality between us is my mother and his father, not fully males. So, first agnates, then cognates. Two examples. A Hindu male dies without making a valid will, leaving behind his both parents, wife, son, daughter-in-law, daughter and son-in-law. Father is not a class 1 legal heir, so he will get nothing. Mother, wife, son and daughter, all are class 1 legal heirs. Each would get 25% stake in the estate. Does not matter that daughter is married. Daughter-in-law would not get because her husband, that is the deceased son, is alive. Had he predeceased the father, then he would have got a stake. Second example, a Hindu male dies, no class 1 legal heirs. In class 2, he has his siblings, that is 2 brothers and 3 sisters, and also his mother's parents. Now here, all of these 6 or 7 people are class 2 legal heirs. But the siblings are a higher category of class 2 legal heirs. Hence, the 2 brothers and 3 sisters, 5 of them put together would share in the entire estate equally. Each would get a 1/5 share, nothing to the mother's parents. Female intestate, earlier under Hindu uncodified law, Hindu female could not own any property other than Stridhan. Stridhan was the property which she got on virtue of marriage, gifts, etc. But now, Section 14 of the Act very clearly provides that a Hindu female can own absolute property, which could be by virtue of inheritance, partition, in lieu of maintenance, by gift, own skill, or by purchase. And she can do whatever she wants with this property. She can gift it away in her lifetime. She can make a will. She can give it in trust, whatever she wants to do. However, there's an exception. Any property received by a gift, will, or any other instrument by a Hindu lady, which provides a restricted right of enjoyment, cannot become her absolute property. So if she got something with a defect, which said that this is not absolute, she cannot take shelter under the law and make it her absolute property. And this decision of Sadhu Singh of the Supreme Court is very apt to explain the point. What happened is that a husband made a will in virtue of his wife, saying that the property I'm giving to you for life interest. That is, till you are alive, you can stay in the house. However, immediately on my death, my 2 nephews will become the owners of the property. So the legal ownership will vest with the nephews, but till you are alive, you can remain residing in the house. They can do nothing. They cannot remove you from the house. The lady took the property and then decided to gift it to the Gurudwara, bypassing her 2 nephews. The nephews went to court and the Gurudwara went to court. The Supreme Court said, look here, the lady received the property with a restricted right of enjoyment. Her husband very clearly gave her a limited interest in the property. She cannot now take shelter under Section 14 and make it her absolute property. So Section 14 is a shield, not a sword. And she cannot dispose of this property by virtue of a gift because it never is her absolute property. So that's an important decision and an important principle which needs to be borne in mind. If a Hindu female dies without making a will, then the order of succession is different from that of a Hindu male. We don't have any class 1, class 2 agnate, cognate. First, everything goes to her son, daughter, or husband equally. If there are none, you treat it as if the husband died without making a will and his legal heirs will get it. So then we look at class 1 of the husband, class 2 of the husband, agnate, cognate. If there are no legal heirs of the husband, go to the parents. If there are no parents, go to the legal heirs of the father. Again, as if he died without making a will, and class 1, class 2 of the father. If there is no one there, go to the legal heirs of the mother, as if she is a female Hindu dying without a will, and then look at son, daughter, husband of the mother. Order of succession again is left to right. There's again an exception. Hindu law is full of exceptions and twists and turns. Section 15 provides for 2 exceptions. If a property is inherited by a Hindu lady from her parents, mother or father, and she dies without any children, that is, she has no son and or daughter, then the property will go back to her father's legal heirs. It will bypass her husband also. So even if her husband is there, he will not get anything as long as she has not left behind any children and the property was inherited from her parents. Inherited means she received it from her father by virtue of will or intestate succession. If she got it by virtue of a gift from her father, then the normal succession pattern applies and the husband can get it. Second exception, if property is inherited from her husband or father-in-law and she dies without any children, no son, no daughter, then property goes to husband's heirs and will not follow the normal succession pattern. But in both the above cases, if she is left behind any children, then the normal succession pattern would apply. 2 examples. A Hindu female dies intestate, leaving behind her husband, 2 sons and parents. Husband and 2 sons will get everything. They'll get a 1/3 share. Nothing would go to her parents. Second example is an exception. A Hindu female dies. She leaves behind a house from her father which she has inherited and she has no children. And who does she leave behind? Her husband, her father's brother, father's sister and husband's sister. Exception applies. Husband would not get anything. Property inherited from parents goes back to father's heirs. So now we have to look at who are the father's heirs. Father's brother and father's sister would be class 2 legal heirs of the father. Therefore, they would get it equally. Nothing to husband, nothing to his sister. Can a stepson be treated as a legal heir of a Hindu male or a female? The Income Tax Act expressly provides that a child includes a step as well as an adopted child. But a plethora of decisions of the Bombay High Court, Delhi High Court and Punjab and Haryana High Court have categorically held that Hindu Succession Act is on a different plateau from Income Tax Act. What is a son under income tax is not necessarily a son under succession law. Here we look at the definition only as per the General Clauses Act, which says that an adopted son is included, but not a stepson. Son must be a natural born son. There must be a direct relationship. Therefore, legal heirs do not cover a stepson from previous marriage of wife or husband, and such a stepson cannot succeed as a legal heir either to the estate of a Hindu male or to the estate of a Hindu female. What about an illegitimate child? Illegitimate child is one born where the marriage is not valid or if the marriage is void under the Hindu Marriage Act. Children born out of such void marriages are also illegitimate. However, Section 17 of the Hindu Marriage Act provides that even if the marriage is void, any children born out of such marriage who would otherwise have been legitimate if the marriage was valid would be considered to be legitimate. So Supreme Court has said that the Hindu Marriage Act confers legitimate status on even otherwise illegitimate kids. And even children born out of live-in relationships are considered legitimate. So in such situation, they can succeed to the assets of the Hindu parents who are party to such void or invalid marriages. But they do not confer any rights in property to any person other than the parents of the illegitimate child. So an illegitimate child cannot succeed to property of his uncle, of his grandparents, of his auntie. He can only lay a claim to whether they can succeed to property of the father or mother. There's a controversy as far as in the Supreme Court as to whether they can claim a share in the father's HUF. We have 2 decisions of coordinate benches of the Apex Court which have rendered different conflicting judgments. and they have been referred to a larger bench, but it has been 10 years, but we've not heard from the Supreme Court on whether an illegitimate child can claim a share in his father's HUF. If a person dies without a valid will, then his legal heirs may apply for a letter of administration from a court. How do you get that? You submit the death certificate as proof, list of legal heirs as per the Hindu Succession Act, depending upon whether deceased was male or female, likely amount of estate of the deceased. An application is made through a lawyer, and public notices inviting claims and oppositions is given by the court. If there are no public notices, or if the claims are set aside, letter of administration would be granted to the legal heirs, based on which they can step into the shoes of the deceased. They can inherit and get all the immovable and movable properties to which the deceased was entitled to. Let's look at income tax of a deceased. There are two relevant SCCs when a person dies. The legal representatives under section 159, which is from the 1st April of the financial year till the date of death, and the executors from the date of death till the date of distribution of the estate under 168. The Madhya Pradesh High Court in Raghunath Das Kakani has held that both 159 and 168 operate in different fields. Who is a legal representative under 159? Any person in law who represents the estate of a deceased, a litigant in a representative capacity, a universal legatee, that is one who gets everything under a will, is also a legal representative. An executor under Income Tax Act for the purposes of 168 includes an administrator or a person administrating the estate of the deceased. Now, 159 says it should include plural legal representatives. So if there are more than class 1 legal heir, son, daughter, mother, and widow, all of them must be proceeded against by the AO under 159. He may make one order on one legal representative representing the entire class of LRs. The LRs are liable to pay tax on his income up to the date of death in the like manner and to the same extent as that of the deceased, and their liability is also limited only to the estate of the deceased. But if they dispose of any assets while tax liability subsists, then personally they become liable. Supreme Court has categorically stated that this liability is only restricted from 1st April of the previous year up to the date of death of the deceased. This is also relevant for filing the income tax return of the deceased on the e-filing portal. And you need to register as a legal heir under 159 by providing the death certificate and any of these documents. Legal heir certificate issued by a court or any Zilla Taluka, surviving family member certificate, registered will, and the easiest to obtain, a letter by a bank mentioning the name of the legal representative as nominee or joint holder to the bank account of the deceased. So you just go to the bank and get it on the letterhead and sign and stamp of the manager that such and such person was a nominee or a joint account holder to the bank account of the deceased. Based on that, you can register on the e-filing portal. Process now is highly simplified. Earlier, you only could do so by obtaining a legal heir certificate. Once the request for registration as a legal heir is approved, you can file the income tax return on behalf of the deceased. In the year of death, the legal heirs will have two filing options. One is his own return in his own capacity, and second as a legal heir of a deceased. Under 168, the tax starts from the date of death till execution of the estate, but it only applies if there is a will. Madras High Court full bench has held it only applies if the will names the executor, or if the will does not name so, but the court appoints an administrator. It would not apply to a person dying without a will. In such a case, in Dhanlakshmi's decision, the Madras High Court has held income from the assets earned after the date of death is accessible in the hands of legal heirs as tenants in common till the assets are distributed by metes and bounds. So if there is no will, then the legal heirs would be taxed under 168 as each owning an equal share based on their status. Assessment of executors under 168 is mandatory, and the assessing officer has no discretion on whether or not to follow the course. A separate PAN needs to be obtained for the estate, and to the extent of income is distributed from the estate, you reduce it from assessment under 168. If there is one executor, status is that of an individual. If there are more than one, status is that of an AOP. Residential status will be that of the deceased. He would either be resident or non-resident. However, an executor under 168 cannot ever be a resident, not ordinary resident. If the deceased was an RNOR, the executor will always be treated as a non-resident. So let us look at an example. A person died on 15th November 2020. How would his assessment returns be filed for that year? For the year 2021, there would be two returns. One from 1st April 2020 to 15th November 2020 under 159, where the legal heirs would file the return. From 16th November 2020, assuming 31st March 21, everything has been distributed, then under 168 on the executor under the will. Executors are entitled to recover the tax paid from the estate of the deceased. Let us now look at an HUF. We are very familiar as chartered accountants with the concept of a Hindu undivided family, but normally we look at it from the tax point of view. Let us now look at it from the Hindu law perspective. It consists of a lineal male descendants from a common ancestor and the wives of the lineal male descendants. Wives are treated as members, whereas the male descendants are treated as co-partners. But there must be a common ancestor who starts the HUF, and he always must be a male. Only a male can start an HUF. A female even today cannot start an HUF. So I can have an Anup Shah HUF. My wife cannot have her own HUF. Now, even daughters are included as co-partners in their father's HUF. So in my HUF, my daughters will be co-partners. But again, a lady cannot start her own HUF. A son is not a must for an HUF. Very, very, very important and common principle, yet something which there is maximum confusion about. Even a daughter is good enough to have an HUF. In fact, moment a person marries and there is some property contributed to the family, HUF has started. But for it to be taxed, two co-partners are needed. The Hindu Succession Act had a major amendment on 9 September 2005. What did the law provide? That the daughter of a co-partner shall by birth become a co-partner in her own right as a son and have the same rights, liabilities and shares as that of a son in her father's HUF. So what does that mean? Daughters and sons have now been placed on parity as far as their father's HUF is concerned. This amendment was only for the father's HUF. Regarding father's personal property, yet class 1 legal heir, daughter was and continues to remain a class 1 legal heir at par with her brother. But she was not at par with her brother in her father's HUF. Now she has been placed on the same pedestal. What happens to the daughter's children? Do they get an equal share in the grandfather's HUF just as the son's children get? I believe if the daughter is at par with the son, her children should also be at par with the children of the son. The law was amended from 9 September 2005, but it did not answer who it applied to. Did it apply to daughters born after this date, married after this date, all daughters living on this date, whether married or unmarried? Was the amendment prospective or retrospective? Did it apply to those daughters born before Hindu Succession Act 1956? Or did it apply to only those daughters whose fathers were also alive on 9 September 2005? Supreme Court settled this issue a few years ago by two decisions, Prakash versus Fulvanti and Dhanamma versus Amar. And it came out with a very unique proposition that this act was prospective, applied to all daughters, whether married or unmarried, who along with their fathers were alive on 9 September 2005. Hence, for a daughter to be a co-partner in her father's HUF, not just the daughter, also the father should have been alive on this date. And it also clarified it did not matter when the daughter was born. She could have been born even prior to 1956. So this was the law till last August. Come August 2020, the Supreme Court 3-member judge overruled these two decisions in Vinita Sharma and said nowhere it is mentioned that daughter of a living co-partner has a share in her father's HUF on 9 September 2005. It says daughter of a co-partner, and daughter should be living, not father should be living. Hence, the only condition is that the HUF must not have been partitioned and she must be alive on 9 September 2005. Whether she was married, unmarried, when she was born, whether her father was alive or deceased did not matter. So this means that even if the father was not alive on 9 September 2005, but she was alive, she would get a share. Yes, of course, if she was not alive, then her children cannot claim a stake in their grandfather's HUF. Only exception to the rule, if her father's HUF was partitioned by a registered deed of partition before the date of 9 September 2005. And Supreme Court stressed on the word registration because it said oral partitions would defeat the rights of the daughters. Therefore, the HUF partition deed must have been registered. Only then she could not claim a share in her father's HUF. Can a daughter now become a karta in her father's HUF? Supreme Court had held that co-partnery is a must for kartaship. Now a daughter can be a co-partner. Therefore, if she is the eldest child, she can become a karta in her father's HUF, and that's the decision of the Delhi High Court in Sujata Sharma versus Manu Gupta. In this case, there were 7 siblings, and the daughter was the eldest. After the father's death, she was treated as the karta. Based on this amendment, could the wife become a karta in her husband's HUF? Now let us look at it. Is a wife a member or a co-partner in her husband's HUF? The amendment of 9th September only touched upon daughters' rights. It did not make all women co-partners wherever they are members. Therefore, in husband's HUF, wife would yet remain an ordinary member. And a member can never become a karta. Therefore, if there is a family of 3, where there is father, mother, and minor son, father dies, mother is not a co-partner, son is a minor, who will become karta? Here, Supreme Court came out with a via media. Wife will become a guardian manager till such time as her son becomes major, and son would then ratify all acts done by the mother. HUF partition means coming apart of what was otherwise a joint family property. You divide the shares either in the properties or you separate out the members by a clear and unequivocal indication to separate. Now, partition could be of 2 types, full or partial. Full means the HUF ends and the tax status comes to an end. All the properties are bifurcated and divided amongst the members in any proportion. And now income tax assessment as an HUF is no longer done. So HUF is no longer a person under 231. It would now be taxed in the individual hands of the members. Partial means partial as to property or partial as to members. So if there are 11 assets and 7 members, if 4 assets are hived off, that's partial as to property. HUF consists with the balance 7. Out of 7 members, 3 leave. HUF continues with the balance 4 members. Income tax does not recognize partial partition. However, Hindu law does recognize partial partition. So if tax is not an issue and HUF status will continue under income tax, then you can go ahead with partial partition. Stamp duty is also an important factor to be borne in mind. Under the Indian Stamp Act and all stamp acts across the country, stamp duty is 2% of the fair market value of the separated share. And separated share means the largest share is subtracted and on the balance 2% is applied. So if there are 4 members and 75% is given to 1 member, then 2% will be applicable on the balance 25%. If there is an equal partition, then only 1 share is subtracted and on the balance 75%, 2% will apply. How can you do a partition? It could be oral, or it could be by virtue of an arbitration award if there is a dispute, or by a court decree or a suit. And if it is by virtue of agreement, it could be by a deed of partition. Who can demand a partition? Any co-partner. So father, son, and now daughter. Mother cannot, that is wife of the father cannot, because she is not a co-partner, she is a mere member. Even after the Hindu Succession Act, she cannot do so during her husband's lifetime. Can daughter claim partition of her father's HUF? Definitely, because now she is a co-partner on the same footing as the son. Hence, she can do. Whether or not she is married is not material. When we look at Hindu law, we also have the concept of ancestral property. Ancestral property is something very unique and very important to understand. It means any property inherited from 3 generations above of male lineage, father, grandfather, great-grandfather. It generally is believed that ancestral property will continue within the family for 3 generations below, that is son, grandson and great-grandson. All will have an automatic and equal right in ancestral property by virtue of being born in the family. Such property is deemed to be HUF property, whether or not actually thrown into an HUF. Now, there is a common view and there is a correct view when we look at ancestral property. The common view is ancestral property cannot be alienated. So if an ancestral property has been partitioned and it comes to someone, then one view is you cannot gift it, you cannot will it. It has to pass on by law to son, grandson, etc. However, this is the common view and not the correct view. The correct view is ancestral property can be alienated. Section 8 of the Hindu Succession Act has modified all old customs and traditions. Supreme Court in Yudhishthir's case has held that property devolving on a person on demise of his father would become his self-occupied property. Again, in Uttam versus Saubhag Singh, the Supreme Court held that once joint property has been distributed, it ceases to be joint and it becomes solely held. And a very important decision rendered by the Delhi High Court in Surendra Kumar, after Hindu Succession Act, for persons inheriting property from paternal ancestors, property is not ancestral in his hands, but is to be taken as self-acquired property. So after the Hindu Succession Act came into force in 1956, the concept of ancestral property is no longer relevant. Any succession done prior to 1956, ancestral property view is correct. But if it is done after 1956, then it would become self-occupied property. Now, the law also provides that a notional partition of the HUF takes place on the demise of the co-partner. So when a person dies, a notional partition, not actual, of the HUF takes place just before his death to determine his share in the HUF, which is then to be bequeathed by his will or is succeeded to by the legal heirs based on intestate succession. Accordingly, on the date prior to the co-partner's demise, one needs to work out the number of co-partners and determine each one's share. So assuming there are 10 co-partners just before a person dies, then each would have a notional 1/10 share. This 1/10 share, one of such 1/10 share belong to the deceased, which he can either will away and make somebody else. So he can say my 1/10 goes to my wife. So she will now end up with a 1/10 share. And if he does not make a will, then his legal heirs, his class 1 legal heirs would get an equal right in it, or class 2 legal heirs will inherit it under the Hindu Succession Act. That is what the Supreme Court held in Arumugam versus Amanyamal's case. 56(2) and gifts from HUF. Gifts received by a member of HUF from an HUF, are they taxable? Can you hold that HUF is nothing but a group of relatives of the person receiving the gift and hence exempt under 56(2)? Relatives can also be seen in plural, and those are the decisions of various tribunals of Rajkot, Mumbai, Hyderabad. But the Ahmedabad tribunal has struck a discordant note saying even if all members of the HUFs are relatives of the donee, HUF is not a relative under law and gift is not exempt. So this is something on which we don't yet have a high court decision, and you would have to look at it as to how each tribunal would take its view. But what would happen if the HUF consists of members who are not relatives under the Income Tax Act? Cousins, that is fathers, brothers, children. They are not relatives under 56(2) explanation. Therefore, can you yet say that the HUF is a relative? I believe no. In that case, it would be difficult to say that the HUF is an exempt donor under 56(2) if it comprises of such relatives who are not relatives as defined under law. Most common question: I have 2 children who will inherit everything with me. Everything is held jointly with me and them. Why make a will? Remember, joint owners are only stopgap owners. Ultimately, property will pass as per Hindu Succession Act. If there is no will, all class 1 legal heirs would end up owning shares in all assets. So if there are 2 flats, each child would have a 50% share in each of the flats and other assets. Now there is cross ownership of assets by all children. If they want to disentangle this cross ownership and they want to segregate, they have to consider income tax and stamp duty costs and lawyers' fees and other consultants' fees. If they cannot amicably entangle or disentangle the cross ownership, there would be bad blood, there would be litigation, there would be court fees, there would be more pain. Hence, do you want to leave behind a legacy of problems? Thus, people must plan. And now let us look at what are the estate planning options. It's a pyramid type of a structure. At the bottom is joint ownership and nomination. Above that would come wills. And at the top, most sophisticated would be trusts, which could be even done during the lifetime. Joint owner concept, very easy to understand. Applicable for flats, bank accounts, fixed deposits, demat shares, mutual funds. Holder could be either or survivor, former or survivor. In either case, the joint holder becomes the sole owner only on the death of the first owner. However, joint owner is not the beneficial owner. Ownership continues to pass to beneficiaries under the will or to legal heirs as per the Hindu Succession Law or Indian Succession Act, depending upon the religion professed by the deceased. Nomination, similar to joint ownership, but it is entitled to receive the assets only on the death of a person. It's a stopgap arrangement till the estate is executed, starting from the date of death till the time that estate is executed. Nomination can be in favor of a minor also, but nominee is by no stretch the beneficial owner. He is only a face for the society to deal with when the person dies. It is a means to avoid delays and wasteful expenditure. What prevails? Various Supreme Court decisions have time and again held will is subservient to nomination. Will supersedes nomination. Once the will is executed, nomination automatically ends. If there is no will, intestate succession will prevail over nomination, and once the legal heirs have been given the assets, nomination will automatically end. We have various Supreme Court decisions in the context of bank, fixed deposits, insurance policy, national savings certificates, and a few years ago, even in the case of flat in a cooperative society. Here, the Supreme Court very clearly laid down that a valid nomination does not automatically transfer title of the flat to the nominee, but he would be entitled to stopgap possession immediately on the person dying. Nomination validly made is binding on the society. Society has no right to examine who is the nominee and why was nomination made in favor of X and not in favor of Y. Who is the ultimate legal owner? All that is not the purview of the nominee or of the society to see. That only a court will decide. Once nomination is executed, it is to be accepted. But nomination has no relevance to the issue of title between the inheritors and successors. That is always determined as per the will or the intestate succession. Similarly, in the case of nomination for shares in a company, Section 72 of the Companies Act 2013 has a very interesting wording. It says shares vest in the nominee, overriding any other law or any other will made by the deceased. Nominee becomes registered owner or transfer the shares without transmitting shares in the name. And a similar wordings are found for nomination with a DP account in the case of demat shares. Hence a question arises, does the nomination in case of a share make the nominee the super owner over the person named in the will? That was the view taken by the single judge of the Bombay High Court in Harsha Nitin Kokate, saying that Companies Act has a different mechanism and nomination prevails over will for shares in a company or a depository account. Same view was taken by a single judge of Delhi High Court. However, a subsequent single judge of the Bombay High Court said the earlier decisions were wrong. They did not consider the decisions of the Supreme Court on nomination being inferior to will under the case of flat in a cooperative society, PPF, bank accounts, etc. Nomination cannot be displaced even by will, and neither the Companies Act nor the depositories deal with succession law. Ultimately, the issue has been settled by a division bench of the Bombay High Court, which has agreed with the second decision that will prevails over nomination even in the case of physical or demat shares, and nomination does not deal with anything related to succession law in the case of a person dying with or without a will. Which will prevail, joint holder or nominee? So the law is very clear that if you are very sure that a person should get everything after death, then make him a joint holder. And if you want that a person gets some asset only after all the joint holders pass away, then you make him a nominee. So a nominee is a must for sole accounts, and it makes the ultimate beneficiary a joint holder and alternate beneficiary a nominee. Ultimately, both should be in synchronization, or else there would be a problem under the Hindu law and looking at it from the hierarchy of the nominee. Coming to the will of the deceased, let us look at what happens when a person dies without a will. Now, what is a will? A will is a wish or a desire of a person as regards his immovable or movable property, and it only applies when a person speaks from the grave. So when a person is no longer alive, his will comes into effect. Till a person is alive, he can keep changing his will n number of times, and he can keep making revisions. Therefore, it is said that a will speaks from the grave of the deceased and only comes into force when a person dies. Who can make a will? Any major person, that is a person of more than 18 years or above, who is of sound mind can make a will. Does not matter whether it is male, female, somebody who does not understand what he or she is doing, they cannot make a will. A person who is deaf, dumb or blind, if he knows what he is doing, then he can make a will. Person who is illiterate or very old person, terminally ill, a lunatic, persons with Alzheimer's disease, all such people cannot make a valid will because they would not be treated as having proper mental capacity of making a will. How do you make a will? You either write or type it, either on a stamp paper or on a plain ledger paper. Now that is a question which is often asked. Stamp paper is only shown in the movies for making a will. You can make a will which is handwritten, which is typed, or which is printed. You do not need a stamp paper, you do not need ledger paper. Can an oral will prevail? That privilege is only given to Muslims or soldiers who are on the field of battle, which is known as a privileged will. The will needs the signature or the thumb impression of the testator, and it needs two witnesses who have attested the signature of the testator. Appoint executors, give a date to the will, and decide which asset should go to whom. Who can be a beneficiary of the will? Anybody can become a beneficiary. It could be a relative, a friend, an employee, a servant, a chartered accountant, a professional. Even a stranger could be a testator or a beneficiary under the will. We all know of the famous example where a person who was the chartered accountant of a large industrial family became a beneficiary under the will and got all the assets. So anybody, even a stranger, can become a beneficiary. There are examples where pets have been inherited up to $380 million or 2,700 crores under a will. We have an example of a Mumbai-based couple who created a trust for their two golden retriever dogs, leaving behind 5 crores as estate. They could be a beneficiary under the will. Then you have the concept of an executor. Executor is the person who puts the will into action. He is the person who will decide how to carry out the activities which the deceased has written under the will, who will get what, how to distribute the estate, how to pay for the funeral and other expenditure. All this is treated as the roles and responsibilities of the executor of the will. Who can it be? Someone close to the testator, someone who is willing to be an executor, and someone who is preferably younger than the person making the will. He has to pay off all the debts and the funeral expenses and would be appointed as the executor. If no such person is appointed as an executor, then the court would appoint an administrator to run the will. That is known as an administrator under the will. Who should be witnesses? The will should be attested by 2 witnesses. And what is the role of the witness? They should have seen the person making the will sign or affix his mark as a manner of acknowledgement. This shows that the witnesses have seen the testator sign or acknowledge the testator's signature. They need not know the contents of the will. So the person signing as a witness need not know what is in the will. All he should testify is that he has seen the person sign in his presence. Can a witness also be a beneficiary? Answer is yes in the case of Hindus and no in the case of non-Hindu, non-Muslim testators. So if a Christian is making a will, a witness cannot be a beneficiary. Same for a Parsi, a Jewish, or an Anglo-Dutch person. Is it advisable? I would say no. Why would you want to have a conflict of interest scenario where the same person is both a witness and the beneficiary of the same will? Therefore, advisable not to make the witness a beneficiary and vice versa. Can the witness be an executor of the will? Here the law expressly provides that irrespective of the community of the person making the will, witness can be beneficiary, witness can be an executor, and executor can be a witness. So that is possible. Let us look at the top 10 myths which one comes across when you look at wills. Will must be on a stamp paper. It can be handwritten or on a plain paper. So there is no need for a stamp paper. Myth number 1. Myth number 2, there is a legal format for a will. That is wrong. There need not be any legal format. There need not be ledger paper, need not be printer paper. It could be handwritten on a plain paper. However, it should be clear and it should be legible. Will once made cannot be changed or altered. That's a myth. Will can be changed n number of times and can be revised n number of times. Will is effective during a person's lifetime. No, a will takes effect only when a person dies. Will cannot exclude near relatives and close family. Will can bequeath everything to charity, to servants, to friends, to pets, including close family members like spouses, kids, all of them are being excluded. So you can do whatever you want under a will. Will must be dated because it is only the last will which prevails, hence a date is must. Nomination never prevails over a will. It is always the will which prevails over nomination. Married women cannot make wills. Now here the law is that all women can make wills, but in the case of Hindus, on marriage, the will is automatically constant, but in the case of non-Hindus, the will automatically leads to an end of the will, and you could then have again to make a will on the basis of the marriage of the lady. Marriage revokes a will only in the case of, not so in the case of Hindus. Joint wills and mutual wills. When a will is made by 2 people jointly, husband and wife, it is known as a joint will. So the couple prepares one will for distribution of both joint and separate properties. It's like a 2-in-1 will. On the death of the husband, all properties would go to wife, and on the death of the wife, everything goes to husband. What happens is also provided once both die. Next, you have the concept of a mutual will. Mutual will means any will where the person under the will cannot take a benefit in a manner contrary to the mutual will. If you want to revoke it, both the parties who made the will should jointly undertake revocation. So by a mutual will, husband bequeaths his estate to wife and wife to husband. But they also provide, if any of them were to predecease, the bequest will go to the wife's brother. Now, wife dies first and husband wants to change the mutual understanding, leaving all to his niece. This revocation is invalid since it is a breach of trust by the husband who executed the mutual will on the understanding that after him the estate should go only as agreed upon. So what this means in a nutshell, that mutual will only go as per the understanding of both the spouses. Husband and wife have jointly agreed it will go in this manner. If one of them dies and the other one wants to change the understanding, he cannot do so alone. He needs both the parties to be present, and only then they can change the mutual understanding. Hence the name is mutual will. Preference has always been to have separate wills for couples rather than joint or mutual wills. But whenever estate planning is a factor, you always prefer separate wills because you could bequeath to one family and not to another. Somebody may want to give to charity. Then it's always better, even when to obtain probate, to have separate wills rather than having joint wills and mutual wills. But there is one scenario when a mutual will is advisable. If the intention is to bind the couple to a certain predetermined pattern without giving a chance to wriggle out after demise of one of the partners. So fear of remarriage of one of the partners could be new claimants to the joint property of the couple. None of the surviving spouses can now alter this mutual will since promises were made which could have been altered only when both were alive. Here one of them passes away and they want to change the understanding. They cannot now do it without both parties being present. Hence, joint wills and mutual wills do have a certain role to play when you want to prevent divorce proceedings leading to new claimants in the family property. Special issues. Will for people with special needs, physically, visually, mentally challenged, those with autism or schizophrenia. It's always advisable to mention the exact nature of the disability, provide for a guardian or a caretaker of such a child, and create a trust under the will for such relatives. Or the beneficiary will only have a life interest. That is, he can stay till he or she is alive. Spouse cannot sell, will, or gift away the asset. They only have a right of residing. Once child becomes the immediate owner, they will get the asset subject to life interest. So those are known as special needs cases, which one generally comes across when making a will. Succession to tenanted properties, tenanted properties transmission will take place only determined by the state rent act. If the rent act provides it will go to those family members who are residing with him at the time of death, then it will go to them. Or if the rent act provides it will go to those family members who are working with the deceased in the commercial property at the time of death, then it will go to them. Some states even have a law that you can will away tenanted property. Then in such a case, the legal heirs will get the property and you can include tenancy as a part of the will. For instance, in the city of Mumbai or the state of Maharashtra, the Maharashtra Rent Control Act does not allow a will to be made for tenanted property. Hence, in Maharashtra, it will only go to those family members working with him or living with him. If there are none, then it will go back to the landlord. But in a state like Uttar Pradesh, the Uttar Pradesh state law permits making a will for tenanted property. Hence, you can make a will in such a case and it would then go as per the will. Registration of wills. It is optional, not mandatory. You may register the will with the sub-registrar of assurances at any time within 4 months from the execution or even thereafter because there is no time limit which is generally applicable to any document. What is the benefit of registration? Registration means you go before the registrar, who is a government authority. You sign in front of him. He will talk to you. He will examine you, not physically, but he will understand whether you are mentally competent to make a will. Witnesses will sign before him. Nobody can allege any allegation of forgery because it has been done in front of a government authority. Hence, there is 0% foolproof as far as forgery is concerned. But it yet does not mean that you knew what you were doing, because you are just signing in front of him. So it could be that you went to a registrar thinking you are signing on some other document, but you just signed it thinking you were misled. Hence, undue influence could yet be a charge. A registered will could be altered at any time by an unregistered amendment or an unregistered will. So you may go to a registrar, make a registered will, come home and sign a new will which is unregistered. That will prevail. But it does help establish genuineness of identity, and forgery allegations are set aside. One may also consider notarization in front of the notary public. So if you go before the notary public and you notarize your will, it does raise a strong presumption of genuineness of the will. Hence, both registration and notarization does help in proving registration. If there are cases where there is a doubt that the family members would dispute the will, it is always advisable to register the will, because then there is a very, very strong presumption that there is no forgery and there was no genuineness question which generally arises in a will. However, that's not to say that some family member would come ahead and say, okay, this is a genuine will, but I have a will which was done after this, which is also a genuine will. Probate is a copy of the will certified by the court. This means that now it is final, that the will is certified by the court, established as authentic, and it validates all the acts of the executors. After a probate is granted, no claim can be raised about the genuineness of the will. You need to make an application to the High Court, pay the court fees. In Mumbai, it is 75,000. Executors and witness of the will should testify in front of the notary or the registrar, and public notice would be given inviting objections, if any, to grant of probate. If there are none, the court would grant the probate. Is it compulsory? Under the Indian Succession Act, probate is compulsory in 3 cases. For Hindus who are living in the cities of Mumbai, Chennai, or Kolkata. So any Hindu living in these 3 cities, they need a probate for their will. Hindu residing any other place in India having a immovable property in Mumbai, Chennai, or Kolkata. So say somebody staying in Indore who has a flat in Mumbai, he would need a probate for his will. Or a Parsi who is covered by the above 2 kind of situations, that is living in Mumbai, Chennai, or Kolkata, or immovable property in these places. Anybody else, probate is not mandatory. So if there is a Hindu residing in Ujjain who does not have any immovable property in Mumbai, Chennai, or Kolkata, he does not need a probate for his will. As long as there is no contest about his will, that is treated as genuine. But for such a Hindu, going with our example of the person who was in Ujjain, if there is a contest, that is somebody says this is not the genuine will and I have the genuine will, and somebody else says no, this is the genuine will, then the only way in which the genuineness can be ultimately proved is by grant of a probate before a probate court. Both the wills would be tested on the anvil of suspicion, on the anvil of genuineness, forgery, mental capacity, undue influence, and finally court would give its seal saying this will or the other will is final. Hence, it is not compulsory when all is hunky-dory for Hindus not in these 3 places, but if there is a contest, then yes, a probate is mandatory. And probate grant could become a long drawn-out process. If you have no dispute, the probate could be granted in as early as 3 to 4 months. But if there is a dispute, it could long last for many years. There are cases which have been in the probate courts for over 10, 15, 20 years. So you have to keep your fingers crossed that if everything is fine, probate would be through. Otherwise, it's a long process. What happens if you want to challenge a will? That is, the will is there and somebody wants to file a suit against it. So he needs to file a suit in the court of law. Court would issue notice to the defendants, that is the persons who have placed the will for finality. Defendant would give his submissions in writing as to why he believes his will is final. Plaintiff, that is the person filing the suit, will give his evidence as to why he believes the will is not final and what he has is the final will. Ultimately, both counsels would argue before the court and court would deliver a verdict. So that is how the process of challenging a will is done. Many times what may happen is that a person who has a will may file a caveat before the High Court. So that means no court would grant a probate for a will without giving a notice to the caveat holder. So if I have filed a caveat in relation to a will by Mr. X, whenever Mr. X's will comes up for probate hearing before the court will first grant me a cause for being heard as to whether or not the probate should be granted. It cannot bypass me and pass an ex parte order. That's known as filing a caveat. New developments when it comes to making a will. We have a video will. The whole video taping is done of the testator reading the contents of his will. So just as my talk is being currently recorded and you can play it back, the testator would read the contents of his entire will. He would sign on video. His witnesses would sign on video. This will help prove that he was mentally competent. He can explain reasons why he is excluding close relatives. There is no question of forgery. There is no question of undue, duress, because you are showing that I know what I'm doing and the whole thing is being videotaped. But it's not foolproof because even after a videotape will, you can go and change it by a plain paper will. Digital will could be a part of the main will or a separate will. Bequeathing passwords to bank accounts, digital data, electronic records, emails, social media, online accounts, all of this become very important when digital assets are important in today's life. And various social media sites like Google, Facebook, Twitter have their own rules if you don't have a will as to how digital assets would be bequeathed. Organ donation, if you want to donate your organs, do not do it as part of the will and have separate instructions to the family members, because otherwise will may be opened up generally after a person is cremated, and by which time organ donation is not possible. I also have a lot of clients nowadays going in for a social customs will, where how they would like the family to carry out rituals after the deceased is no more there is laid down, whether they want a 13-day mourning period, whether they want the last rites to be carried out in a holy place, whether they want to bypass all of this and just give everything to charity, feed the poor, or spend on education. All of this is known as a social customs will. Lockdown will. When we are in lockdown, how can we not talk of lockdown? What if there is a lockdown like we currently have in the state of Maharashtra? After 4 p.m., difficult to go out. On weekends, difficult to go out. If I want to make a will, how do I make a will in such a case? There's no particular format, no stamp paper. I don't have a printer at home. I can't go to the lawyer's place. No problem. I can write it down in my own handwriting on a plain piece of paper, but it should be legible. I need to have 2 witnesses. Now, this could become a problem. If the neighbors are willing, fine. But if they are reluctant to do so because of social distancing or because of COVID, then what happens? You may request your servants, maids, watchmen, and ask them to act as witness. They should either write their name or at least affix their thumb impression if they are not able to write their name. What if there are no servants also? In such a case, adult family members of the testator may be approached. Beneficiaries can be witnesses and witness can be beneficiaries in the case of Hindus. But for non-Hindus, this is not possible. Can the witness practice social distancing and witness the will also? So can there be a 6 feet distance? Can the witness stand 6 feet apart and see me sign my will? Yes, there are English cases which have held that witness and executor were separated through a glass partition, and the witness could see through the glass door and see the testator sign. It was held it was a valid will. As long as he can see you sign clearly, it would be a valid will. In jurisdictions such as Scotland, New Jersey, and Canada, even online witnessing by Zoom or any other video link is possible. So the client and the testator could have a Zoom link, just as you are seeing me on Zoom. I'll sign it. The solicitor on the other end would witness it, and he would send a certificate that I have witnessed the signing of this will by Anup Shah on Zoom on 3rd of July at such and such time, and that is a valid certificate. When lockdown ends, he will send the physical copy of the witness. India currently does not allow witnessing online by Zoom or Skype or Microsoft Teams or any other platform. You have to see the testator physically sign in your presence. So let us compare will versus no will. Under no will, who gets what? Law decides no say to the person or his family members. In case of a will, personal choice of the deceased. Can stranger get anything under no will scenario? No. Only family members and legal heirs will get it. In case of a will, anyone can get it. There is no bar. Even a total outsider can get it. Can guardians for minors be appointed? Say under the no will scenario, the property goes to a minor son or daughter. Can you appoint a guardian for him? Answer is no. In case of a will, yes, you can. What if there is a nomination? Then the law will prevail. If there is a nomination, the will prevail. In either case, law or will prevails over the nomination. Law cannot be changed because it is final. Will can be changed n number of times. Nothing to be done in a no will scenario. In case of a will, yes, you need to make a will. Can temporary planning be done for COVID? That is, I make a temporary will for COVID and change it after that. No, that does not happen in no will scenario. But under will, yes, I can revise the will later once things get better. So a lot of flexibility is provided under a will scenario. What about tax issues? There's no tax on inheritance in India, whether under a will or on intestate succession. For a will, it is expressly provided that receipt of a capital asset under a will is not a transfer under 47. But the same exception is not provided for intestate succession. However, intestate succession is never a transfer to start with. It is a transmission. Therefore, even though there is no express provision, no tax is levied when you inherit something under the laws. Cost of capital asset of the legatee or the legal heir is same as that of the deceased. Period of holding of the legatee or the legal heir is same as that of the deceased. Hence, when should the indexation start? Same as that of the previous owner or from the date of acquisition by the legal heir? There was some confusion on this, but now various high courts like Bombay High Court, Gujarat High Court and Calcutta High Court have unanimously held it starts from the date of ownership of the previous owner. So all three, cost of capital asset, period of holding and indexation, will be same as that of the previous owner. What about cost of stock in trade? Say certain shares were owned as stock in trade by the deceased and they come to that of the legal heir. The cost will be same as that of the testator. And if there is actual cost of depreciable asset which has been acquired by inheritance, same as that of the previous owner as reduced by depreciation allowed to the previous owner. So whether it is a depreciable asset, whether it is a stock in trade or whether it is a capital asset, all will be that which was there to the previous owner. What about tax under 56(2)(10) of the Income Tax Act? 56(2)(10) levies a tax on receipt of money or property on any capital asset received without consideration or for inadequate consideration. But there are certain exceptions. Any money or property received under will or inheritance, there is no tax in the hands of the recipient. It can be received from anyone, even a stranger. It is not necessary that the person giving the property is a relative of the recipient. Hence, if there is a will in favor of a chartered accountant, the chartered accountant will not pay tax under 56(2)(10) because there is no condition that the person making the will should have been his relative. Both testamentary or intestate succession, example Hindu Succession Act, Shariat law, all of these are covered in the exception. What happens if a sum of money or a capital asset is received as a nominee? There's no exception under 56(2)(10. But it's not a case of receipt at all. It's not received as a beneficial owner. Nominee does not receive. He is only a stopgap arrangement, as held by the Supreme Court in numerous cases. Hence, it can be said there is no receipt of property and there should not be any tax liability under 56(2)(10) at all. For 56(2)(10) exemption, it is not necessary that a probate or a succession certificate or a letter of administration are obtained. All these are legal formalities and they have no bearing on the tax position. As long as a death certificate and a will copy, or in case of intestate succession, a legal heir showing that you were the legal heir is shown to the satisfaction of the assessing officer, I believe that should be adequate proof. Interesting decision before the Mumbai Tribunal in Purves Poonawalla. Here there were two claimants to a will. One of them decided to pay off the other in return for the first one not pressing his claim before the probate court. So the person receiving the money agreed not to litigate before the probate court. The question was whether the sum of money received by him would be taxable under 56(2). The Mumbai Tribunal said consideration under 56(2) has to be understood as per Section 2 of the Contract Act 1872. And consideration there is defined to be receipt of any sum of money for agreeing to do or not to do any act in return. Agreeing not to contest a will is valid consideration under the Contract Act, and hence it is valid consideration under 56(2)(10), and therefore the sum received was not held to be taxable. What about cross-border wills and tax? As I mentioned, we live in the era of the liberalized remittance scheme. Most Indians or several Indians have global assets. What about tax on inheritance in India of global assets? If I have made a will for my assets in Dubai and I receive those, what happens? There is no tax under 56(2). It does not distinguish between will of Indian or global assets. Hence, even if you receive assets from a family member who held a flat in Dubai, there would be no tax in India. But you have to bear in mind tax in foreign countries. There is estate duty in several developed nations. For instance, the United States levies an estate duty at 40% after a lifetime gift cum estate duty credit of $11.2 million. In addition, various states levy estate duty. For instance, California has the highest state estate duty. But at the same time, a state like Texas has zero estate duty. And that is why many US persons are relocating to Texas, including someone like Elon Musk. UK has an estate duty at 40% after an exemption known as the nil rate brand of £325,000. Plus, one residential house also forms part of the nil rate band if it passes to direct descendant. So you have to bear in mind the UK, US, Singapore estate duty when you're looking at cross-border wills and inheritance, although nothing is there in India at the moment. Let's now look at private trusts. Why look at a trust structure? It helps avoid estate duty if and when it comes. Currently, thankfully, we don't have estate duty in India. However, whenever it comes or if it comes, a trust would be the only shelter against estate duty. It reduces succession disputes like in the case of wills. You don't need probates. There cannot be disputes as to which is the final will. Trust is done during the lifetime of a person and hence there is no dispute as to which is final. Complete control during the lifetime and even after death by virtue of the trust deed provisions. And it is useful if the beneficiaries are minors, pets, or such people. Trust takes effect immediately or on death of a person, whereas will takes effect only on death of a person. Can you have probate, dispute, litigations in a will? Yes, but not so in the case of a trust. Control after the death is not possible in case of a will, but is possible in case of a trust. Estate duty saving possibility, yes, in some cases. Sorry. And wealth planning for minors, pets, mentally challenged relatives, daughters-in-law, all of this is possible in the case of a trust. Now, trust we must understand is a private trust under the Indian Trust Act. It is different from a public trust. There's no concept of registration with the Charity Commissioner. There's no income tax exemption, no Section 80G benefits, no Section 11, 12A registration under the Income Tax Act. So the income of the trust is not exempt. Registration of the trust deed with the sub-registrar, that is optional. Just as any document or any instrument can be registered with the sub-registrar, that can also be done for a private trustee. But you cannot register this with the Charity Commissioner. The trust can own property and investments and assets, and is very much in vogue today for minors, unborn family members, married daughters, handicapped relatives, mentally unstable relatives, pets, and the whole wide world is possible. So therefore, private trusts have become one of the most popular estate planning mechanisms in today's world. What are the basic features? You have a settlor, you have a trustee, and you have a beneficiary. The settlor is the person who sets up the trustee jointly with the trustee by introducing certain corpus in the form of money or property to be held in trust for the benefit of the beneficiary. So settlor will be the person who will have a trusted person known as a trustee who will administer the corpus for the benefit of the beneficiary. Trust taxation is a little bit complex and we don't have the time to go into it in detail. Probably if we had a separate session on trust taxation, we could have done it. But I'll just like to deal with the high points. You need to determine whether it's a revocable or an irrevocable trust. That is, does the settlor retain power to get income under the trust? Then it is revocable, else it is irrevocable. In case of a revocable trust, the income of the trust will be taxed in the hands of the settlor. In case of an irrevocable, it is taxed in the hands of the trust or the beneficiaries. Whether it's a specific trust or a discretionary trust, we'll examine what that means. Should the beneficiaries be taxed or should the trustees be taxed in capacity of the trust? Is there a tax on donor on contributing assets to the trust? Is there a tax on the trust on receipt of a gift from the donor? Is there a tax on the trust on distribution to the beneficiaries? Is there a tax on the beneficiaries on distribution by the trust? What happens to Indian beneficiaries in case of a foreign trust of which they are beneficiaries? Can the foreign trust be taxed in India or can the beneficiaries be taxed in India? And if they have not disclosed the fact of them being beneficiaries in a foreign trust, can there be criminal action by virtue of prosecution and action under the Black Money Act of 2015? This, in a nutshell, is the entire hierarchy and the structure for trust taxation, both domestic and foreign. Other than this, I believe there would be very few other issues which you would come to. But this one slide to explain it would take up a session by itself. Discretionary and specific. This is something which becomes important. What do you mean by specific trust and what do you mean by discretionary trust? Specific trust deed is one where the shares of the beneficiaries are specified in the trust deed, and discretionary is one where it is left to the discretion of the trustees. Hence, if you say that there are two beneficiaries in a trust and both have an equal share, it is known as a specific trust deed. However, if you say there are three beneficiaries in a trust and who gets what and whether each one gets anything is left to the discretion of the trustees, it's known as a discretionary trust deed. Specific trust deed, individual shares are specified in the deed and are ascertainable on the date of the deed. Even if power is given to the trustees to determine the shares and the methodology is being laid down, it would be treated as a specific trust deed. So if you determine a class of beneficiaries and you lay down the methodology for determining the shares, it would be a specific trust deed. So a father says that I have 3 sons. Each of my sons and his children would get an equal share, and his children, if their father is not alive, his children would get an equal share in his father's share. So that is a methodology laid down. So what that means, that a father has 3 sons. So they would all get 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 share. Now, one of the sons dies and he has 2 daughters. So the 2 daughters would get a half share in the 1/3 share which their father would have got. So 1/6 to one daughter and 1/6 to the other daughter. In the second son's case, he has no children, so he would get 1/3. In the third son's case, he has 3 children. So each of them would get a 1/3 in the 1/3 share which their father would have got. So you have laid down the methodology, and hence even this would be a specific trust. How do you tax a specific trust? The character of the income, the dividend, interest, capital gains, rent, should be the same as it would be in the hands of the beneficiaries. A trust is taxed in the like manner and to the same extent as that of the beneficiaries, and this is the cardinal principle of taxation under section 161 of the Income Tax Act. And you also have the Supreme Court's decision in Nizam's Trustees, where it is very clearly laid down that the income would be taxed in the hands of the beneficiaries in the same manner, and that character would be retained in the hands of the trust also. Once income is taxed in the hands of the trustees, subsequent distribution of the same would not attract any further tax in the hands of the beneficiaries. Income is taxable at the rate applicable to each beneficiary. However, capital gains would be as per normal provisions, that is under 111A or 112 or 112A. But if even 1 rupee of business income is present in the specific trust, then the entire income gets taxable at maximum marginal rate of 42.74%. Discretionary trust, no specific method or indication as to who gets what. You can get a share from 0 to 100% in the income and or the corpus of the trust. All income is taxed at MMR, but if there is income which is taxable at special rates, then the same would be taxed at the special rates. For instance, long-term capital gain, short-term capital gain on listed shares, and all dividend would not be taxed at 42.74, but at the 15% maximum surcharge which is applicable to an individual. What is the status of a trust which is a discretionary trust? A lot of confusion on this point. A lot of people believe that a discretionary trust, because it is taxed at MMR, is taxed as an AOP. Answer is no. If all the beneficiaries are individuals, the trust is also an individual. The status is the like manner and same extent as that of the beneficiaries. They would not be taxed as an AOP in such a case. What about a gift of a private to a private trust? There is no capital gains on the donor or the settler. Any gift to a private trust is exempt, provided it is an irrevocable trust. If it is revocable, is the gift taxable? There's no clarity. Is it not a case of dealing with one's own self, and hence there can be no tax on one's own self? That's the correct way to look at it. But this is something on which we don't have any precedent or clarity. What about the gift received by the trust? Would it be taxable under 56(2)(10) in the trust's hand? Here, in 2019, the law provided an exception that any trust will not be taxed on receipt of money or property if it is a trust created by an individual solely for the benefit of his relatives. Hence, we have to look at the trust constitution in relationship to the donor. All the beneficiaries must be relatives as defined under the Income Tax Act of the donor. The trust could be specific or discretion. Settler has to be an individual, because obviously a gift from a corporate cannot have relatives as beneficiaries. Exemption is to settler and to other donors. It is only necessary that the trust is settled for the benefit of the relatives. Trustees could be individual or corporate. It does not matter there, because the relationship is between the donor and the beneficiaries. Beneficiaries always must be individuals. Only then can they be relatives of somebody. They cannot be corporates, partnerships, LLPs, or other any entity like an AOP. It has to be an individual donor and an individual beneficiary. Trustee could be anyone. Trust can open a bank account in its own name, can have a permanent account, a tax deduction number, can own immovable property like land, building, flat in its own name. It cannot open a demat account in the name of the trust, but it can have it in the name of the trustees and link the PAN of the trust and the bank account of the trust with such demat account. This is because SEBI does not allow a trust to open a demat account in its own name. It can also own units of mutual fund. A huge number of promoters of listed companies are transferring their listed shareholding individually held by them to trust to ensure better succession planning and better continuity of the listed company. So after they pass away, there will be no risk of a will or a probate or an intestate succession which would jeopardize the running of the company. Hence, they are parking their promoter shareholding in family trust by virtue of a gift. Does this trigger the SEBI takeover regulations of 2011? Answer is yes. However, you would need to apply SEBI for exemption, and SEBI has laid down a clear-cut guidelines on the requirements of the trustee and who can be trustees and how they would grant permission for the trust. Various corporates like Dr. Reddy's, GMR, JCorp, Alembic, all of these have applied for exemption and got permission from SEBI for setting up a trust under which the beneficiaries are the erstwhile promoters, trustees are individuals, and the trust deed has to follow the guidelines of SEBI. After that, the takeover exemption panel would grant a permission for the company promoter shareholding to be owned by the trust. Let's look at gifts and release deed. Gift is a transfer of existing movable or immovable property made voluntarily and without consideration from donor, that is a transferor, to a donee. A gift deed is a must for any immovable property under the Registration Act and the Transfer of Property Act, but it is not a must for movable property. It can be done by mere delivery and possession and by virtue of a receipt. But if you make a deed for movable property, then you have to consider stamp duty in Madhya Pradesh or in any other state as on a conveyance when a gift deed is made. One interesting scenario always arises: can a gift once made be taken back? I have always seen cases where parents said, I made a gift of my property to my son or daughter. They are now not taking care of me. Can I take back the gift? Answer is a clear-cut no. A gift is like a bullet. Once fired, you cannot retrieve it. The only exception is a conditional gift. If the gift deed was made based on conditions precedent under Section 126 of the Transfer of Property Act, then if those conditions are not satisfied, you can revoke the gift. So the Supreme Court in Ashokan versus Lakshmi Murthy held completed gifts cannot be revoked and unilateral cancellation is not allowed. So these decisions of the Punjab and Haryana High Court and the Andhra Pradesh High Court show that a parent sought to rescind a gift of house since the children were not taking care of them. Held, there was nothing in the deed to show that this was a condition precedent to the gift. Therefore, revocation is not allowed even in circumstances which have changed after making of gift. Can the donor reserve a life interest? If you recall in the beginning of my lecture, I gave you the analogy of a husband gifting a property to his nephews, but giving life interest to his wife. Here, can he reserve life interest for himself? That I gift this property to my wife, but till I'm alive, I can stay in this house. Would that affect the gift? Answer is no. Supreme Court in Rajamma's case has said retention of right to use property during the donor's lifetime would not affect transfer of ownership in favor of donee. So as long as you only have a right to use property, the donor can continue to do so. Moment he dies, it becomes an absolute gift in favor of the donee. When we are talking about gifts, 56.210 becomes very important. Here, there is an exception of various types. So a gift in excess of 50,000 rupees per year in aggregate would be taxable in the hands of the donee. But if it is a gift received from certain relatives, there is no tax in the hands of the donee. If it is a gift received in contemplation of a death, that is, if the donor is fearful that he will die and he makes a gift, that would be treated as a gift which is not taxable in the hands of the donee. However, here there is a question mark whether this applies to both movable and immovable properties, because under the Indian Succession Act, a gift in contemplation of death can only be made for movable properties. There is no such similar wordings under 56(2)(10), but the Madras Tribunal, the Chennai Tribunal, has held that the same principles would apply even under 56(2)(10). Hence, a gift of immovable property cannot be made in contemplation of death, and it would revoke back to the donor if he lives. So if a person is afraid that because of COVID he is going to die and he gifts certain shares and money to his family members, if he dies, then it would not be taxable in the hands of the beneficiaries. But if he survives by some good foresight and good luck, then the gift has to come back to him. Only then 56(2)(10) will not apply. That's the view of the Chennai Tribunal in F. Susai Raju. Whether it's binding or not is a different question. Release deed. In restructuring of family-owned properties, execution of a release deed is a popular mode of estate planning. One co-owner renounces his share in favor of another co-owner. Consideration may or may not be paid for the release deed. So in case of an intestate succession, all legal heirs automatically become co-owners. Only way to give up one's share is a release deed, and NOC is not applicable. You have to go by a release deed, and that is the only way in which you can give up your right. Let us look at a brief snapshot of estate planning and income tax and stamp duty. If you get anything as a nominee, there should not be any tax or stamp duty. Receipt under intestate succession, no tax, no stamp duty. Receipt under a will, no tax, no stamp duty. Receipt on HUF partition, no if there is full partition and there is stamp duty. Receipt under a gift, no tax provided 56(2)(10) does not apply, and stamp duty is applicable. Creation of a trust, no tax if 56(2)(10) exemption applies, and stamp duty is applicable. Family settlement, if you cannot resolve disputes amicably, then the only way to do so is by virtue of a family settlement. So if you don't want to go to court, and if you don't want bad blood, and you don't want disputes, don't want to have litigation, you want to preserve family honor and property and peace, go in for a family settlement. It must be bona fide to resolve disputes and rival claims by a fair and equitable distribution and allotment of properties. It could even be oral, and then a memorandum is executed recording what has been orally agreed. Even future potential disputes can be covered. Today things are good, but you are afraid that once the second and third generation have started joining business, there could be disputes. And the consideration and the edifice of a family settlement is expectation of amity, goodwill amongst persons having common relations with each other. Courts generally lean in favor of a valid family arrangement, but for that it must be valid. It must be genuineness, which must be demonstrated. Otherwise, even income tax can question it and can apply GAR. So GAR would apply if the department can show that this is not a valid family arrangement. This is only a facade done to get over the tax provisions. Very interesting. In spite of India having so much of joint family owned businesses and properties, the entire law on family arrangement is based on case law. Important concepts and principles of family arrangement are that the courts would make every attempt to sustain a family arrangement rather than to avoid it. And the criteria applied for family arrangement is
second session or third session.
The principles which have been laid down are that family arrangement is not a transfer under section 47. Hence, there is no capital gains when assets are transferred from one member to another. Even married daughters can be made a party to family arrangement, but only if she has signed the MOU. A married Hindu lady can execute a family settlement with her father's side legal heirs. Whether companies can be made a party to family settlement, income tax has taken a view no in the case of Sea Rock Investments, Karnataka High Court, and B.A. Mohta, Bombay High Court. However, whether you can make them party to the family settlement, Supreme Court has taken a view in Mohan Thakur that they can be made a party. So it's a little bit of a dichotomy and no clarity, but generally income tax would not avoid the same tax exemption to companies under a family settlement. 56(2)(10) is something which needs to be considered if there is gifts between non-family members, say cousin to cousin, brothers who are sons of two brothers and cousins. If there is any gift between them under a family settlement, would that be treated as attracting the rigors of 56(2)(10)? Here you can argue that family settlement, preserving of honor and peace within the family is valid consideration, and hence 56(2)(10) should not apply. There is a Mumbai tribunal decision of Gundecha on the same point. Various Supreme Court decisions have said no registration is required if a memorandum only records what has been done, but if the family settlement brings about a transfer of immovable property, then you need registration and stamp duty. Very thin line between these two concepts, and therefore you need to have a very carefully drafted agreement. Practical experience has shown registrars and cooperative societies generally do not transfer merely based on an unstamped, unregistered family settlement, even though the law is so clear. We'll wrap up with some other important principles on estate planning. Hindu minority and guardianship deals with the powers and duties of guardians. Natural guardians are those who are laid down by law. So the natural guardian of a Hindu minor is always his father, and in his absence, it is the mother. If there are none, it is a guardian appointed by the court. A Hindu can also appoint a guardian under the will for his minor children. So a Hindu can say, after me, my wife, and failing my wife, such and such relative would become the guardian of my child. If it's an illegitimate child, the mother is always the natural guardian, whereas if it's a legitimate child, the father is always the natural guardian. Very important to know, a guardian can do all acts necessary, reasonable for a minor's benefit. But if he wants to sell, gift, or transfer any immovable property belonging to the minor, he would need prior permission of the court, even if it is for the benefit of the minor. This is a very important caveat to be borne in mind, that if there is any immovable property held in the name of the minor, you cannot sell it without prior permission of the court, even if you are getting a windfall gain. Hindu Adoption and Maintenance Act provides that valid adoption can be done, and the adopted child would be considered as the natural child of the adopted family. Very unique case, a Hindu male can adopt only with his wife's consent. If he does so without his wife's consent, the adoption is void. But a Hindu female can adopt only if she is a widow or she is unmarried or divorced. Even if her husband gives a consent, she cannot adopt in his presence, because she is neither a widow, nor unmarried, nor divorced. So very unique proposition on the Hindu Adoption and Maintenance Act. The adoptee child must be below 15 years of age. On adoption, all ties are severed with his natural family of birth. He is entitled to inherit properties of his adoptive parents. He is deemed to be the child of his adoptive parents from the date of adoption, and from such date, all his ties are created in the family of adoption, and they are severed in the family of birth. This decision is very useful to show that an adopted child would also be a lineal ascendant descendant under 56(2)(10). Section 2 of the Income Tax Act very clearly says child includes an adopted child, but it does not say anything for lineal ascendant and descendant. Based on this decision and old decisions of the Rajasthan High Court in the case of Dunni Devilal under the estate duty, it can be contended that for 56(2)(10), lineal ascendant descendant includes an adopted son or an adopted daughter. The Hindu Adoption and Maintenance Act provides various maintenance obligations which are thrust upon a Hindu. A Hindu wife must be maintained by her husband during her lifetime till marriage subsists. After that, she is entitled to alimony from her divorced husband under the Hindu Marriage Act. If it's a Hindu widowed daughter-in-law, then her father-in-law is duty-bound to maintain her, provided she has not remarried and she has no property of her own, and if the father-in-law has joint family property. So not only the husband, But after his death, even father-in-law has to maintain the daughter-in-law under certain circumstances. Hindu minor sons and Hindu unmarried daughters of whatever age have to be maintained by their parents under the Hindu Maintenance Act, and Hindu aged parents must be maintained by their children under the Adoption and Maintenance Act. There is also another maintenance obligation under the Domestic Violence Act of 2005. If there is a lady in a domestic relationship, she has a right to reside in the shared household where she lives if she is a victim of domestic violence. So if she was living with her husband in a house, then she has a right to continue to reside there if she is a victim of domestic violence. And the Supreme Court has said this even applies to live-in relationships. Bombay High Court went a step forward and said, irrespective of whether she has a legal right over such a home, and even the father-in-law's home where they were residing as a couple would become a shared household, and she will have a right to reside there in the father-in-law's home where her husband has no legal right. So very wide meaning given to shared household under the Domestic Violence Act. What is the meaning of maintenance? Food, clothing, residence, education, medical needs are all treated as maintenance. And for an unmarried Hindu daughter, even reasonable amount of marriage expenditure. We'll wind up with the Special Marriage Act. Any marriage registered under the Special Marriage Act, we've been reading a lot about this recently in the newspapers for certain MPs from West Bengal. So if there is a marriage between a Hindu and a non-Hindu, they usually require it to get registered under the Special Marriage Act. Even if the marriage has already been performed as per Nikah or as per Hindu Vedas, you can register it under Special Marriage Act. Once a Hindu marries a non-Hindu and gets it registered under the Special Marriage Act, the Hindu Succession Act ceases to apply to the non-Hindu and to the Hindu, and Indian Succession Act takes over. So generally, if a Muslim gets his marriage registered under the Special Marriage Act, Shariat law will cease to apply to the Muslim. What is the benefit of this? Under Shariat law, a Muslim can make a will only for 1/3 of the property. Balance 2/3 go as per Shariat law. Now, if two Muslims get their marriage registered, their nikah registered under the SMA, then they can now make a will for their entire 100% estate. Also, if it's a Hindu whose marriage is registered under Special Marriage Act, such Hindu will cease to be a member of the HUF, which he is a member. So it changes the succession pattern for the couple and also for any child born out of such marriage. So even children will cease to be governed by Hindu Succession Act and will now be governed by Indian Succession Act. But if it is a Special Marriage Act registered for two Hindus, that is two Hindus who get their marriage registered. So generally what happens is if you got married abroad, say in Dubai or Bangkok, you may want to come back and get the marriage registered under the Special Marriage Act. Then Hindu Succession Act continues to apply. You continue to remain a member of HUF. Your children continue to be governed by Hindu Succession Act. This is only when Hindu marries non-Hindu or two Muslims or non-Hindu communities get registered under the Special Marriage Act. We also have a similar issue of a daughter of a Hindu converting a religion, that is renouncing Hinduism and marrying a Muslim or Christianity. What happens there? Can she continue to inherit her father's property? It's a very interesting question. Daughter of a Hindu marrying a Muslim or a Christian, embracing Islam or becoming a Christian and renouncing Hinduism. Can she continue to inherit her father's property? Now let us look at it in two scenarios. Father made a will. Father can make a will in favor of anybody on the street. Hence, it does not matter whether the person he made a will is Muslim, Christian, Hindu. Hence, father can make a will in favor of daughter irrespective of her new religion. What if father died intestate? Then, which is the law to look at? Hindu Succession Act. Now, who changed religion? Did the father change religion or did she change religion? Answer is she did. Father did not. Hence, father continues to be governed by Hindu Succession Act. He is continued to look at who are his class 1 legal heirs. Daughter continues to remain a class 1 legal heir. The fact that she is now a Christian does not matter. Hence, she can inherit her father's property. Would she be part of her father's HUF if her marriage is now registered under Special Marriage Act? No, she would not be treated as part of her father's HUF. So she cannot be a co-partner in her father's HUF. And her children will be disentitled to succeed to the Hindu's properties. This is an important embargo. Her children cannot be legal heirs to their grandfather's property because she is no longer because she has got her marriage registered under the Special Marriage Act. What about a reverse case? Daughter of a Muslim converts to Hinduism and marries a Hindu. She will now be governed by Hindu Succession Act and not by Shariat law. She can now make a will for all her property. There are no restrictions like under Shariat law. If there is no will, then intestate succession law as per Hindu Succession Act will apply and not as per Shariat law. So this, in a nutshell, are the provisions governing conversion of religion. Thank you very much, friends, for a patient hearing. And now I think we have some time for some question answers.
Great, sir. It was a very excellent session. और हम कह सकते हैं कि गागर में सागर भरने जैसा है. बहुत कम समय में आपने बहुत सारा एक्सप्लेनेशन दिया और जो प्रैक्टिकल एस्पेक्ट्स को लिया है. Definitely, this would be the queries. You have taken up the myths because in the succession and all this will planning, there are various myths prevailing since long, and this particular session would clear it up. So, thank you again, sir. And definitely, we need a few more sessions of yours. Excellent kind of session, sir. It would be my pleasure to thank you on behalf of ICAI Indore branch.